The morning sun cast long shadows across the quiet streets of Bucklebury as Carole Middleton sat at her kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had grown cold hours ago. The steam had stopped rising from the porcelain cup, much like the hope that seemed to have drained from her heart over the past few days. She stared out the window at the garden where Catherine used to play as a child, where she had learned to ride her first bicycle, where she had picked flowers for school projects with such enthusiasm. The call had come 3 days earlier. The voice on the other end was professional, calm, but the words hit Carole like a physical blow. Catherine needed surgery. Major surgery. The kind that required weeks of recovery, the kind that made mothers wake up in cold sweats at 3 in the morning, checking their phones for updates that never seemed to come fast enough. Carole had always been the strong one in the family. When Michael struggled with his business ventures, she was there with practical solutions and unwavering support. When Pippa faced media scrutiny after Catherine's wedding, Carole had been her rock, shielding her younger daughter from the worst of it. When James went through his difficult period in his 20s, uncertain about his path in life, it was Carole who sat with him through countless nights, helping him find his way. But this was different. This was Catherine. Her eldest daughter, the one who had carried the weight of royal expectations with such grace, the one who had transformed from a shy university student into one of the most photographed women in the world. The one who, despite all the protocol and public scrutiny, still called her mother every Sunday evening to chat about ordinary things like recipes and school projects for the grandchildren. The surgery had been scheduled for early morning at the London Clinic, one of the most prestigious private hospitals in the country. Carole had wanted to be there from the beginning, but Catherine's team had gently explained that it would be better to wait. The media attention around any royal medical procedure was intense, and the family needed space to focus on Catherine's recovery without the added pressure of photographers tracking every visitor. So Carole had waited. She had cleaned her house 3 times, organized cupboards that didn't need organizing, and baked enough food to feed a small village. Her neighbors in Bucklebury had been kind, dropping off casseroles and offering to help with anything she needed, but Carole couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness that had settled in her chest like a weight. Michael had tried to distract her with practical matters. He spoke about the business, about their upcoming holiday plans, about anything except the fact that their daughter was lying in a hospital bed somewhere in London, recovering from surgery that they weren't even allowed to know the full details about. Royal protocol meant that even as Catherine's parents, they were kept at a careful distance from certain medical information. It was for everyone's protection, they were told, but it felt like torture. The waiting had been the worst part. Carole remembered waiting for news when Catherine was born, but that had been filled with anticipation and joy. This waiting was different. It was heavy with worry and the kind of fear that only mothers understand. The fear that something might go wrong, that complications might arise, that the daughter who had always seemed so strong and capable might need her mother in ways that royal protocol wouldn't allow. On the second day after the surgery, Carole had received a brief call from Catherine herself. Her daughter's voice was weak but determined, the way it had always been when she was unwell as a child, but trying to be brave. "Mummy, I'm fine," Catherine had whispered into the phone. "The doctors say everything went well. I just need to rest for a while." But Carole could hear the exhaustion in her daughter's voice, could picture her lying in that sterile hospital room, probably worrying more about everyone else than about her own recovery. That was Catherine's way. Even as a little girl, she had always put others first, always tried to make sure everyone around her was comfortable and happy. "Can I come and see you?" Carole had asked, though she already knew the answer. "Not yet, Mummy. Maybe in a few days, when things settle down. I promise I'm being well looked after." The promise did little to ease Carole's worry. She wanted to be there, wanted to fluff Catherine's pillows and make sure she was eating properly and getting enough rest. She wanted to do all the things that mothers do when their children are unwell, regardless of whether those children happen to be future queens. That evening, Carole had called her sister, Mary, who lived in Australia. The time difference meant that Mary was just starting her day, and she listened patiently as Carole poured out her fears and frustrations. "You know what the hardest part is?" Carole had said, staring out at the darkening garden. "It's not being able to just be her mother. Everything has to go through proper channels, everything has to be considered in terms of protocol and public relations. But she's my daughter first, before she's anything else." Mary had understood. She had watched from afar as Catherine's life had changed so dramatically after meeting William, had seen how the family had had to adapt to royal expectations while trying to maintain their own identity and relationships. The third day brought better news. Catherine was recovering well, and the doctors were pleased with her progress. But she was still weak, still needed rest, and visitors were still limited to immediate family only. Even that was carefully managed, with William's schedule coordinated by teams of private secretaries and security personnel. Carole had spent that day in her garden, tending to the roses that Catherine had always loved. She found some peace in the familiar rhythm of pruning and weeding, in the simple act of nurturing something beautiful. The garden had always been her refuge, the place where she could think clearly and find perspective on life's challenges. As she worked among the flowers, Carole thought about Catherine's childhood, about the little girl who had been so determined to succeed at everything she tried. Catherine had never been the most naturally gifted of her children, but she had always been the most persistent. When she struggled with mathematics, she had spent hours practicing problems until she understood them. When she found hockey difficult at first, she had stayed after school to practice until she made the team. That persistence had served Catherine well in her royal role. Carole had watched with pride as her daughter had navigated the challenges of public life, had learned to make speeches and attend formal events with confidence. She had seen Catherine develop from a somewhat awkward young woman into someone who could hold her own in any situation, who could speak with conviction about causes she cared about. But now, in this hospital room somewhere in London, Catherine was just a daughter who needed her mother. And her mother was sitting in a garden in Bucklebury, feeling more helpless than she had ever felt in her life. The call came on the fourth morning. William's private secretary explained that Catherine was feeling stronger and that she would like to see her parents. The visit would need to be brief and private, with security arrangements that would ensure minimal disruption to the hospital's other patients and staff. Carole could come that afternoon. Carole had never gotten ready for anything so quickly. She chose a simple dress, knowing that anything too formal or too casual would attract the wrong kind of attention. She packed a small bag with things she thought Catherine might need, her favorite hand cream, some photographs of the children, a book of poetry that Catherine had loved since university. The drive to London felt endless. Michael drove while Carole stared out the window, watching the familiar countryside give way to suburban developments and, then, to the busy streets of the capital. She thought about all the times she had made this journey for happier occasions: Catherine's graduation from university, her wedding, the births of her children. This felt different, weighted with concern and the strange formality that now surrounded even the most personal family moments. The London Clinic was an imposing Victorian building that had been carefully modernized while maintaining its historical character. As their car approached the entrance, Carole could see security personnel positioned discreetly around the building. Even for a private visit, Catherine's presence meant that elaborate precautions were necessary. They were met at a side entrance by a member of the hospital staff who guided them through corridors that seemed to stretch on forever. The building was quiet, with the hushed atmosphere that all hospitals seem to share, but Carole could sense the heightened security that surrounded their visit. Cameras had been positioned to ensure privacy, and staff members they passed had clearly been briefed about the importance of discretion. As they approached Catherine's room, Carole's heart began to race. She had been preparing herself for this moment for days, but now that it was actually happening, she felt overwhelmed by emotion. Her hands were shaking slightly as the nurse knocked gently on the door and announced their arrival. The room was larger than Carole had expected, with tall windows that let in plenty of natural light. There were flowers everywhere, arrangements that she recognized as coming from gardens at various royal residences. The sight of them made her smile slightly. Even in a hospital room, Catherine was surrounded by beauty and care from the family she had married into. And there, in the bed by the window, was Catherine. She looked pale and tired, smaller somehow than she had seemed just a week ago. But she was awake and alert, and when she saw her parents, her face lit up with the same smile that had melted Carole's heart when Catherine was a baby. "Mummy," Catherine said softly, extending her arms. The word broke something loose in Carole's chest. All the worry and fear and helplessness of the past few days came rushing to the surface. She had been so strong, so determined to handle this situation with dignity and composure. But seeing her daughter in that hospital bed, seeing the evidence of what she had been through, was more than Carole could bear. The tears came without warning, hot and overwhelming. Carole tried to maintain her composure, tried to be the strong mother that Catherine needed, but her emotions were too powerful to contain. She moved toward the bed, her vision blurred with tears, her hands reaching for her daughter. Catherine's own eyes filled with tears as she saw her mother's distress. Despite her weakness, she struggled to sit up straighter, to be the one offering comfort instead of receiving it. "Oh, Mommy, please don't cry," Catherine whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "I'm okay, I really am. Please don't be upset." But Carole couldn't stop the tears. They were tears of relief, of love, of the profound fear that every mother feels when their child is vulnerable. They were tears for all the times over the past few days when she had felt so helpless, so removed from the person she loved most in the world. Michael stood quietly by the door, his own eyes moist as he watched his wife and daughter. He understood Carole's reaction completely. They had both been carrying this burden of worry, but Carole had carried it more heavily, as mothers always seem to do. Catherine reached out weakly and took her mother's hand, squeezing it gently. The familiar touch was like coming home for Carole. This was her daughter, the little girl who used to crawl into bed with her parents during thunderstorms, who had scraped her knees learning to ride a bicycle, who had cried with disappointment when she didn't get the part she wanted in the school play. "Sit down, Mummy," Catherine said softly, patting the edge of the bed. "Tell me what's been happening at home. How are the gardens looking?" Carole wiped her eyes with a tissue that Michael quietly handed her. She knew Catherine was trying to divert attention from her own situation, trying to make everyone else feel more comfortable. It was so typically Catherine that it made Carole want to cry all over again. "The roses are beautiful this year," Carole managed to say, settling carefully on the edge of the bed. "The ones by the kitchen window have had more blooms than I've ever seen. And Mrs. Patterson from next door has been asking about you every day. She made you a get-well card with her grandchildren." Catherine smiled, and, for a moment, she looked more like herself. "That's sweet of her. I remember her grandchildren visiting last Christmas. The little boy was fascinated by the idea that I lived in a palace sometimes." The conversation felt surreal to Carole. Here they were, sitting in a private hospital room surrounded by security, talking about neighbors and gardens as if Catherine wasn't the future Queen of England. But that was what she had always loved about Catherine's approach to her royal role. Despite everything that had changed in her life, she remained fundamentally the same person who had grown up in Bucklebury, who remembered neighbors' grandchildren and worried about her mother's feelings. Michael approached the bed slowly, his expression a mixture of relief and concern. "You gave us quite a scare, sweetheart," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "I know, Daddy. I'm sorry. I didn't want to worry anyone, but the doctor said it was important to take care of this now rather than wait." Catherine's voice was stronger now, though Carole could see the effort it cost her to speak normally. "What exactly happened?" Carole asked gently. She had been given limited information about Catherine's condition, and the uncertainty had been almost worse than knowing the full truth. Catherine glanced toward the window, seeming to gather her thoughts. "It wasn't anything immediately life-threatening," she said carefully. "But it was something that needed to be addressed. The doctors have been monitoring it for a while, and they decided that surgery was the best option." Carole felt a fresh wave of emotion at the realization that Catherine had been dealing with health concerns without telling the family. She understood the reasons for privacy, especially given the intense public interest in anything related to Catherine's well-being, but it hurt to think that her daughter had been carrying this burden alone. "How long have you known?" Michael asked, echoing Carole's thoughts. "A few weeks," Catherine admitted. "But you know how these things go. There were tests and consultations, and everyone wanted to be absolutely certain about the best course of action. William has been wonderful through all of it. He's barely left the hospital since the surgery." Carole looked around the room and realized that William wasn't there. She had expected to see him, but the room contained only the three of them and a nurse who was quietly checking Catherine's chart. As if reading her thoughts, Catherine explained, "William stepped out to take a call from his father. He'll be back in a few minutes. He wanted to give us some time alone first." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Carole deeply. William had always been considerate of the Middleton family's relationships with Catherine, never making them feel like outsiders in their daughter's life. But this felt particularly generous, given the circumstances. "How are the children handling it?" Carole asked. She had been worried about George, Charlotte, and Louis, knowing that they must be confused and frightened by their mother's sudden absence. Catherine's face grew tender. "They think I'm just very tired and need to rest. William has been amazing with them, keeping their routine as normal as possible. They've been making me get-well cards, and George has been writing me little notes about what he's been doing at school." The mention of her grandchildren brought fresh tears to Carole's eyes. She could imagine little George, serious and thoughtful beyond his years, trying to make his mother feel better. Charlotte, with her spirited personality, was probably frustrated at not being able to visit. And Louis, still so young, was likely confused by the changes in his routine.
"I've been thinking about them constantly," Carole said. "Is there anything I can do to help? Anything at all?"
"Actually, there is something," Catherine said, brightening slightly. "William's been managing everything beautifully, but I know it's a lot for him.
Could you possibly help with some of the children's activities when I'm released?"
"Nothing official, just normal grandmother things. Maybe take George to his football practice, or help Charlotte with her art projects?" The request was simple, but it meant everything to Carole. After days of feeling helpless and removed from the situation, being asked to help with something concrete felt like a lifeline.
"Of course," she said immediately. "Whatever you need, whenever you need it." They talked for a while about everyday things, the children's schools, upcoming family events, changes in Bucklebury.
Catherine seemed to gain energy from the normalcy of the conversation, sitting up straighter and asking detailed questions about people and places from home. Carole found herself studying Catherine's face, looking for signs of pain or discomfort. Her daughter had always been stoic about physical problems, even as a child. She remembered Catherine breaking her wrist during a school hockey match and walking off the field without complaint, only mentioning that it hurt a bit when they got home hours later.
"Are you in much pain?" Carole asked directly, knowing that Catherine might not volunteer the information. Catherine considered the question carefully. "It's manageable," she said. "The medications help, and the doctors say it should improve each day. Honestly, the worst part is the boredom.
I'm not used to lying still for this long."
Carole laughed despite everything. Catherine had always been active, always busy with some project or commitment.
Even as a small child, she had found it difficult to sit still for long periods. The idea of her being confined to bed for weeks must be torture for someone who was used to managing a packed schedule of royal engagements. "I brought you some things," Carole said, reaching for the bag she had packed. "Your favorite hand cream, and that book of poetry you loved at university.
I thought it might help pass the time."
Catherine's face lit up as she saw the familiar items.
"Oh, Mummy, thank you. I've been thinking about that book, actually. There's a poem in it about resilience that I wanted to read again."
As Catherine carefully turned the pages of the book, Carole was struck by how young she looked. The public Catherine was always so polished, so perfectly put together for official events and photographs. But here, with her hair loose and no makeup, wearing a simple hospital gown, she looked like the university student she had once been. "Found it," Catherine said softly, pointing to a page. "Listen to this." She stood in the storm, and, when the wind did not blow her way, she adjusted her sails.
"I've been thinking about that line a lot lately."
The words resonated with Carole. Catherine had indeed learned to adjust her sails throughout her life, adapting to circumstances that no one could have predicted when she was growing up in Bucklebury. The shy girl who had once struggled with public speaking had become someone who could address thousands of people with confidence and grace. William appeared in the doorway, looking tired but relieved to see Catherine sitting up and talking with her parents. He had changed out of his formal clothes into jeans and a casual shirt, making him look younger and less like the future king he was destined to become. "How are we doing?" he asked gently, moving to Catherine's side and taking her hand. "Much better now that Mummy and Daddy are here," Catherine replied, squeezing his hand.
"How was your call?" "Fine. Just updating everyone on your progress." William turned to Carole and Michael. "Thank you for coming. I know how much this means to Catherine."
Carole studied William's face and could see the strain of the past few days written there. He was trying to maintain his composure, but she could tell he had been deeply worried. The bond between William and Catherine had always impressed her. They seemed to genuinely support each other through the unique pressures of their role. "How are you holding up?" she asked William directly.
"Better now," he admitted.
The worst part was not knowing exactly how the surgery would go. But the doctors are very pleased with Catherine's recovery so far. They spent the next hour talking as a family, sharing stories and updates that helped normalize the situation. William told them about the children's reactions to their mother being in the hospital, including Louis asking if he could send Catherine one of his favorite toy cars to help her feel better. Catherine laughed at this story, and the sound filled Carole's heart with relief. Her daughter's laugh was the same as it had always been, bright and genuine. Whatever Catherine was going through, her essential self remained unchanged. As the afternoon wore on, Carole could see that Catherine was getting tired. Her responses were becoming slower, and she was starting to lean more heavily against her pillows. But she seemed reluctant to end the visit, as if she too had needed this connection with her parents as much as they had needed to see her. "We should let you rest," Carole said gently, though every instinct told her to stay longer. "Not yet," Catherine protested weakly. "Tell me about James. How is his business doing?" They talked for another 20 minutes about James's latest ventures and Pippa's family, but, eventually, it became clear that Catherine needed to sleep. Her eyes were becoming heavy despite her best efforts to stay alert and engaged. "We'll come back tomorrow if you'd like," Michael offered. "I'd love that," Catherine said, settling back against her pillows. "Maybe you could bring some photos of the garden? I'd like to see how everything looks this year." As they prepared to leave, Carole leaned down to kiss Catherine's forehead, a gesture that had been part of their bedtime routine for so many years. Catherine's skin felt warm and soft, and, for a moment, time seemed to collapse. She was kissing her little girl goodnight, just as she had thousands of times before. Walking through the hospital corridors afterward felt like moving through a dream. Carole's emotions were still raw from seeing Catherine, but there was also a profound sense of relief. Her daughter was going to be okay. The surgery had been successful, and Catherine's spirits seemed strong despite the physical challenges she was facing. The drive home was quiet at first. Michael concentrated on navigating London traffic while Carole stared out the window, processing everything they had experienced. Finally, she broke the silence. "She looked so small in that bed," Carole said softly. "I keep forgetting sometimes that she's still my little girl, underneath everything else." Michael nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "But, did you see how she perked up when we started talking about the children? And the way she was making jokes with William? She's going to be fine, love. Our Catherine is stronger than she looks." They stopped for dinner at a small pub they had frequented during Catherine's university years, back when visiting her in London was simpler and didn't require security arrangements. The familiar surroundings brought back memories of easier times, when their biggest worry had been whether Catherine was eating properly and keeping up with her studies. "Remember when she called us in tears because she thought she failed her art history exam?" Carole reminisced, picking at her food. She was so convinced her life was over, and then, she ended up getting one of the highest marks in her class. "She's always been her own worst critic," Michael agreed. "Even when she was tiny, she expected so much of herself." They talked about Catherine's childhood, sharing memories that helped put the current situation in perspective. Catherine had always faced challenges with determination and grace, whether it was struggling with a difficult subject at school or dealing with the intense media attention that had started when her relationship with William became public. "I'm proud of how she's handled everything," Carole said eventually. "The royal role, the public scrutiny, being a mother in such unusual circumstances. Sometimes I wonder if we prepared her well enough for all of this." "No one could have prepared her for what her life became," Michael replied. "But I think our job was to give her the foundation to handle whatever came her way. And, looking at who she's become, I think we did all right." That evening, back in Bucklebury, Carole found herself in Catherine's old bedroom. They had kept it largely unchanged since Catherine moved out, though it had been redecorated over the years. Photos from Catherine's childhood and university years lined the dresser, showing her progression from a chubby-cheeked toddler to a confident young woman. One photo in particular caught Carole's attention: Catherine at age 16, after winning a hockey tournament at school. She was muddy and exhausted, but grinning with pride and holding up a small trophy. The determination in her eyes was the same expression Carole had seen that afternoon in the hospital room. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Carole lay awake thinking about all the what-ifs that every parent considers when their child faces a health crisis. What if the surgery hadn't gone well? What if there were complications? What if Catherine needed more medical intervention in the future? But, mixed with the worry was gratitude. Gratitude that Catherine had access to the best medical care available, that she had William's support throughout the ordeal, that the outcome had been positive. And gratitude for the afternoon they had shared, the reminder that beneath all the royal protocol and public responsibilities, Catherine was still fundamentally their daughter. The next morning brought a phone call from William. Catherine had slept well and was feeling stronger. The doctors were pleased with her progress, and she was asking when her parents might visit again.
Would this afternoon work? William asked.
Catherine specifically mentioned wanting to see those garden photos you offered to bring.
Carole spent the morning selecting the best pictures from her recent gardening efforts.
She chose images that she thought would particularly appeal to Catherine: the rose garden in full bloom, the vegetable patch where they had worked together during Catherine's childhood summers, the new herb garden that Carole had started the previous spring.
The second hospital visit felt different from the first.
Carole was more prepared emotionally, and Catherine seemed significantly stronger. She was sitting up in a chair by the window when they arrived, wearing a dressing gown instead of a hospital gown and looking more like herself.
"Mummy, Daddy." Catherine greeted them with genuine enthusiasm. "I've been looking forward to this all morning. William said you brought pictures of the garden?" Carole settled into the chair beside Catherine and opened the folder of photographs. Catherine's reaction was immediate and delighted.
"Oh, the roses are spectacular this year. And look at the size of those tomatoes."
"You've been busy."
Catherine studied each image carefully, asking detailed questions about different plants and commenting on changes since her last visit home. "I've been thinking about the cottage garden we planned last time I was home," Catherine said, looking at a photo of the herb garden.
"When I'm better, could we work on that together?
I'd love to create something that the children could help with when they visit." The request filled Carole with happiness. Despite everything that had changed in Catherine's life, she still wanted to maintain those simple family traditions that had always been important to them. Gardening together had been one of their shared pleasures since Catherine was small. "Of course," Carole replied. "We could plan it so that there's something blooming or ready to harvest whenever you're able to visit. The children would love having their own sections to tend." They spent nearly 2 hours looking through photos and planning the garden project. Catherine's energy seemed stronger than the day before, and her color was better. She was asking detailed questions and making specific suggestions, clearly engaged with the idea of having a project to look forward to. William joined them for part of the visit, sharing his own ideas for the garden and mentioning how much George had been asking about his grandmother's flowers. The conversation was relaxed and family-focused, a welcome respite from the formal atmosphere that often surrounded royal family interactions. "The children have been asking when they can see Granny and Grandpa," William mentioned.
"Would you be willing to spend some time with them while Catherine recovers?"
"Nothing too structured, just normal family activities." Carole felt her heart leap at the suggestion.
"We'd love that. What did you have in mind?"
"Well, George has been working on a project about butterflies for school. He's been asking questions about gardens that attract them. And Charlotte wants to learn how to bake properly, not just the simple things we do at home."
Catherine smiled at this.
"Charlotte has been very serious about her baking lately.
She informed me that she wants to make proper birthday cakes, not just biscuits."
The idea of teaching Charlotte to bake brought back memories of Catherine's own childhood culinary adventures. She had been determined to master cooking techniques that were far beyond her years, approaching recipes with the same methodical persistence she brought to everything else. "I'd be delighted to teach Charlotte," Carole said. "And we could work on a butterfly garden for George's project at the same time." They made plans for the grandchildren to visit Bucklebury the following weekend, giving Catherine something to look forward to and providing practical help for William, who was juggling his official duties with caring for 3 children and supporting his recovering wife. As the visit drew to a close, Catherine took her mother's hand again.
"Thank you for yesterday, Mummy.
I didn't realize how much I needed to see you until you were here." "You don't need to thank me for that," Carole replied, squeezing Catherine's hand. "Being here for you is exactly what mothers are supposed to do." "I know, but everything is so complicated now. Even something as simple as a hospital visit requires so much planning and coordination. Sometimes I miss the days when family things could just be family things." The wistful tone in Catherine's voice touched Carole deeply. She could hear the young woman who sometimes felt overwhelmed by the unique pressures of her position, who occasionally longed for the simplicity of her former life. "Catherine," Carole said gently, "no matter what else changes in your life, you will always be our daughter first. Everything else comes second to that. William understands that, the children understand it, and anyone who matters understands it." Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but they seemed to be tears of relief rather than sadness.
"I love you, Mummy. I love you too, sweetheart. More than you can possibly imagine."
The third visit, 2 days later, brought even better news. Catherine was being released from the hospital sooner than expected, though she would still need several weeks of recovery at home. The doctors were pleased with her progress, and Catherine was eager to get back to familiar surroundings. "I can't wait to be in my own bed," Catherine confided to her mother.
Hospital beds are comfortable enough, but there's nothing like home. Carole had been involved in discussions about Catherine's care during her recovery.
The family had decided that Catherine would convalesce at their country home rather than in London, where media attention would be more intense and privacy harder to maintain.
"Will you come and stay for a while when I'm released?" Catherine asked hopefully.
"William has been wonderful, but he has obligations he can't postpone indefinitely. And I think the children would benefit from having Granny there to maintain some normal routines." The request was exactly what Carole had been hoping for. The prospect of being able to care for Catherine properly, to make sure she was eating well and following her recovery protocols, felt like a gift after the helplessness of the past week. "Try and stop me," Carole replied with a smile. "I'll pack my bags tonight." They spent the visit making practical plans for Catherine's recovery period. They discussed meal plans that would support healing while appealing to Catherine's appetite, activities that would keep her entertained without requiring too much physical energy, and ways to gradually reintroduce her to her official duties as her strength returned. Catherine had a long list of correspondence that had accumulated during her hospital stay, and she was anxious about falling behind with her royal obligations. But the doctors had been firm about the need for genuine rest during the first weeks of recovery. "I've been thinking about this poem from the book you brought me," Catherine said, opening to a marked page.
"It talks about the difference between resting and giving up.
I want to make sure I'm truly resting so that I can come back stronger, not just rushing back before I'm ready." The insight showed Carole that Catherine was approaching her recovery with the same thoughtfulness she brought to everything else. She wasn't just passively waiting to feel better, she was actively working to understand what her body needed and how to support her own healing process. The final hospital visit came 3 days later, when Catherine was discharged. Carole had arrived early to help pack Catherine's belongings and to be there for the transition home. Catherine looked remarkably better than she had just a week earlier, though she was still obviously weak and moving carefully.
"Ready to go home?" Carole asked, helping Catherine into the wheelchair that hospital protocol required for leading patients.
"More than ready," Catherine replied with a genuine smile. "I want to see sky that isn't framed by a window, and I want to hear birds that aren't city birds." The journey to the country estate was peaceful, with Catherine dozing in the back seat while Carole and William took turns pointing out familiar landmarks along the route. When they arrived, George, Charlotte, and Louis were waiting on the front steps with homemade welcome home signs and shy smiles. The reunion between Catherine and her children was gentle and emotional. The children had clearly missed their mother intensely, but they had been well prepared for her condition and approached her carefully. George, ever the thoughtful older brother, immediately showed Catherine the butterfly book he had been working on while she was away. That evening, as Catherine rested in her own bedroom for the first time in over a week, Carole reflected on the journey they had all taken. The fear and helplessness she had felt during those first days after Catherine's surgery seemed like distant memories now, replaced by gratitude and renewed appreciation for the preciousness of family bonds.
Catherine was going to be fine.
More than fine, she was going to be stronger for having faced this challenge with such grace and determination. And Carole knew that her own relationship with her daughter had been deepened by sharing this difficult time together. The weeks that followed Catherine's return home established a rhythm that surprised Carole with its normalcy. Despite the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together, the days were filled with ordinary moments that reminded her of Catherine's childhood summers in Bucklebury. There were afternoon teas in the garden when Catherine felt strong enough, quiet conversations while Catherine rested, and the simple pleasure of being needed by her daughter again. Carole had moved into one of the guest bedrooms and quickly established herself as the family's support system. Her days began early, preparing breakfast for the children and William before he left for his official duties. George, Charlotte, and Louis had adapted to their grandmother's presence with enthusiasm, treating her as a special addition to their routine rather than an emergency caretaker. "Granny," Charlotte announced one morning over breakfast, "I want to make Mummy a special cake for when she feels completely better.
Can you teach me to make one with flowers on it?"
The request led to an afternoon baking session that Catherine watched from her chair by the kitchen window. She couldn't participate physically yet, but she offered suggestions and encouragement as Charlotte carefully measured ingredients and followed Carole's patient instructions. That looks exactly like the cakes we used to make when Mummy was your age, Carole told Charlotte, who beamed with pride at the comparison.
Catherine smiled at the memory.
I remember being so frustrated when the icing wouldn't cooperate. You were always so patient with my attempts to make everything perfect.
You get that from your father, Carole replied with a laugh. The perfectionist streak runs strong in this family.
George's butterfly project had evolved into a comprehensive study of their garden ecosystem, with Carole serving as his research assistant and field guide. Together, they had identified 17 different species of butterflies and created a detailed map of which areas of the garden attracted which varieties.
Did you know that some butterflies can only see red flowers if they're very bright?
George informed his mother seriously during one of their afternoon garden tours.
Granny taught me that.
We're going to plant more bright red flowers in the section by the pond.
Catherine listened to George's enthusiastic explanations with evident delight.
Even in her weakened state, she was fully engaged with her children's interests and development.
Carole could see how much Catherine had missed these everyday interactions during her hospital stay.
Louis, at his young age, had simply accepted his grandmother's extended presence as a wonderful addition to his world. He had claimed her as his special companion for bedtime stories and had insisted that she accompany him on his daily walks around the estate grounds. Granny knows all the best places to find interesting stones, Louis confided to his mother one evening. And she doesn't get tired as fast as Daddy does when we want to explore.
These small observations from the children touched Carole deeply.
She had worried about disrupting their routines, but instead found that she was enriching them in ways that felt natural and beneficial for everyone. William had initially been hesitant about accepting help, clearly concerned about imposing on his in-laws.
But, as the days passed, he visibly relaxed into the arrangement.
Having Carole there meant that he could fulfill his royal obligations without constantly worrying about Catherine and the children. I can't thank you enough, he told Carole one evening after returning from a day of engagements in London.
Catherine seems so much more relaxed knowing that you're here with the children. And, frankly, so am I.
This is exactly where I want to be, Carole assured him. Taking care of family is what families do. The comment seemed to resonate with William, who nodded thoughtfully.
Catherine is lucky to have parents who understand that family comes first, regardless of circumstances.
As Catherine's strength gradually returned, she began taking on more activities with the children. At first, these were quiet pursuits that didn't require much physical energy, reading together, helping with homework, watching films on rainy afternoons. But, gradually, she was able to participate in garden walks and even short outdoor games. Carole found herself documenting these milestones with photographs, creating a visual record of Catherine's recovery that they could look back on later. There was something deeply satisfying about capturing these moments of progress and healing. You've become the family historian, Catherine observed one afternoon, watching her mother take pictures of the children's latest garden discoveries. Someone needs to remember these days, Carole replied. They're important, even if they feel ordinary while we're living them.
3 weeks into Catherine's recovery, they received unexpected visitors.
Pippa and James drove up from London for a surprise weekend visit, bringing with them energy and laughter that lifted everyone's spirits. You look wonderful, Pippa declared, hugging Catherine carefully.
Much better than I expected.
I feel much better, Catherine replied honestly.
Having Mummy here has made all the difference.
I don't think I realized how much I needed this kind of support until she provided it. James had brought his camera equipment and spent the weekend creating a professional photo session that managed to be both formal enough for potential official use and relaxed enough to capture genuine family moments. The images he took showed Catherine looking healthy and happy, surrounded by her children and parents in the garden they all loved. These are beautiful, Carole said, reviewing the photos on James's camera screen. They really capture how Catherine looks when she's truly at peace. The weekend visit had an unexpectedly profound impact on Catherine. Seeing her siblings in their childhood home, watching them interact with her children, seemed to remind her of the foundations that had shaped her character and values. I've been thinking about something, Catherine told her mother the evening after Pippa and James left. All of this has reminded me how important it is to maintain the connections that matter most. I don't want my children to grow up feeling that royal obligations always come before family relationships. The statement revealed something that Carole had sensed but hadn't wanted to voice. Catherine sometimes struggled with balancing her public role against her private desires. The recovery period had given her perspective on what truly mattered to her. Your children will learn from watching how you handle these things, Carole replied gently. They're seeing that family supports each other through difficult times, that we make time for what matters most. As Catherine's 6-week recovery period drew to a close, preparations began for her gradual return to official duties. The transition was being carefully managed to ensure that she didn't overcommit too quickly, but Catherine was clearly eager to resume her royal responsibilities. I've missed the work, she admitted to her mother. I know that sounds strange, but I really have. There are projects I care about, people I want to help. Being away has reminded me why those commitments matter to me. Carole helped Catherine prepare for her return by organizing her correspondence, updating her calendar, and ensuring that her recovery needs were built into her schedule. It felt good to be useful in this practical way, to contribute to Catherine's professional life as well as her personal healing. The final week of Catherine's official recovery brought a steady stream of visitors from royal staff, updating her on developments during her absence and preparing for her return. Carole found herself impressed by the care and consideration that surrounded these interactions. Everyone seemed genuinely concerned about Catherine's well-being, not just her ability to fulfill her duties. Your staff really care about you, Carole observed after a particularly lengthy briefing session. I'm fortunate in that way, Catherine agreed. It took time to build a team that understands both the work and the person doing it. But I think we've managed to create something special. The night before Catherine's first official engagement since her surgery, Carole found her daughter standing by the bedroom window, looking out at the garden where they had spent so many hours together during her recovery. Are you nervous about tomorrow? Carole asked, joining Catherine at the window. A little, Catherine admitted. It's been so long since I've had to be on in that way. I'm worried about having enough energy, about whether I'll be able to focus properly. You'll be fine, Carole said with confidence. You're stronger now than you were before the surgery. And you've had time to remember what really matters to you. That will make the work easier, not harder. Catherine turned to look at her mother with tears in her eyes. Thank you, Mummy. For everything. For being here, for taking care of all of us, for reminding me who I am underneath everything else. Carole felt her own eyes fill with tears at the heartfelt gratitude in her daughter's voice. You don't need to thank me for loving you, she said softly. That's just what mothers do. I know, but this was different. You could have just visited occasionally and sent flowers. Instead, you moved your whole life to take care of mine. That goes beyond ordinary mother love. The comment made Carole think about the unique challenges that Catherine faced in her role. Most people could expect their families to drop everything during a health crisis, but Catherine's position made even that simple expectation complicated by protocol and public interest. Perhaps, Carole said carefully, but you're not an ordinary daughter. Your life requires extraordinary measures sometimes. I'm just grateful that I was able to provide what you needed. They stood together in comfortable silence, looking out at the garden that had been such a source of comfort during Catherine's recovery. The roses were still blooming, though their peak had passed, and the vegetables were reaching their autumn harvest time. Will you come back and help with the cottage garden we planned? Catherine asked. I'd like the children to see us working on it together. Of course, Carole replied immediately. We'll make it exactly what you envisioned. Something beautiful that brings the family together. Catherine's first day back to official duties went smoothly, though she returned home tired in a way that reminded everyone that her recovery was still ongoing. But there was also a satisfaction in her exhaustion, the good tiredness that comes from meaningful work rather than the depleting fatigue of illness. How did it feel? Carole asked over dinner that evening. Right, Catherine replied simply. It felt right. I've missed being able to contribute, missed the connections with the people and causes I care about. But I also appreciated it more today than I have in a long time. As Carole prepared to return to Bucklebury the following week, she reflected on the unexpected gifts that had emerged from such a frightening situation. She had been given weeks of uninterrupted time with her daughter and grandchildren, time to be needed and useful in ways that weren't always possible given the complexities of Catherine's life. More importantly, she had witnessed Catherine's remarkable resilience and grace under pressure. Watching her daughter handle both illness and recovery with such dignity had reinforced Carole's pride in the woman Catherine had become. The final morning brought a family breakfast that felt both celebratory and bittersweet. Catherine was clearly ready to resume her independent life, but everyone had grown accustomed to Carole's daily presence.
You'll come back soon, won't you, Granny?
Charlotte asked, clinging to Carol's hand.
Of course, darling.
Anytime your mummy needs me, anytime any of you need me. Catherine walked her mother to the car, moving slowly but steadily.
I don't know how to properly thank you for these weeks, she said as they embraced goodbye.
You already have, Carole replied. By letting me be your mother when you needed one most.
That was a gift to me as much as anything I gave to you.
As Carole drove back to Bucklebury, she felt a deep sense of completion. The frightening uncertainty of Catherine's surgery had been replaced by the satisfaction of recovery accomplished and relationships strengthened. Her daughter was not just physically healed but emotionally renewed, with a clearer understanding of her own priorities and support systems. The experience had reminded all of them that beneath the extraordinary circumstances of Catherine's public life lay the ordinary bonds of family love that sustain and strengthen everyone involved. And, in times of crisis, those bonds had proven to be more than strong enough to carry them through whatever challenges they faced. Most importantly, Carole had learned that her role in Catherine's life was far from over. It had simply evolved into something richer and more meaningful, built on mutual respect and the deep understanding that some relationships transcend all other obligations. The tears she had shed during that first hospital visit seemed like ancient history now, replaced by the quiet confidence that their family could handle whatever the future might bring.